Welcome back to the Explainer. Today, we are cracking the code on one of the absolute oldest, most foundational, and honestly, most fascinating chess openings in the history of the game, the Italian game. Whether you're a club regular just trying to refine your repertoire, or you're brushing up on your board geometry, this opening has something incredibly valuable to teach you. We're going to completely break down its rich history, the most critical variations you'll face, and the shifting philosophies that have kept this opening totally relevant for over 5 centuries. So here is our game plan for today. Number 1, the Italian bishop emerges. Number 2, gioco piano, the quiet game. Number 3, classical versus modern control. Number 4, the two knights defense. And finally, number 5, practical tactics unveiled. All right, let's jump right into section 1, the Italian bishop emerges. Okay, let's dive into this. The Italian game kicks off with 3 absolutely essential steps. White plays pawn to e4, instantly claiming the center. Black responds symmetrically with e5. White develops the knight to f3 to attack the e5 pawn, and black defends it with knight to c6. And then we hit the defining moment. White plays bishop to c4. This piece right here is the famous Italian bishop. By placing it on this highly active c4 square, White is immediately drawing a bead on black's f7 pawn. And you know why that's so crucial, right? At the start of the game, that f7 pawn is literally the weakest point in black's entire camp, because it's protected only by the king. This is a massive takeaway for your own games. Putting early pressure on f7 is the absolute cornerstone of White's strategy here. It sets the stage for the whole shebang. But before we get into how black replies, we really have to appreciate the history of this opening because it's just incredible. We can actually trace its origins all the way back to 16th century manuscripts by players like Pedro Damiano and Giulio Palerio. Fast forward to the 19th century, and it became the absolute dominant weapon of the Romantic era of chess. We're talking wild, swashbuckling variations like the Evans Gambit, famously championed by Paul Morphy. Now, interestingly enough, in the 20th century, it actually saw a pretty steep decline at the top levels. Grandmasters largely just favored the Ruy Lopez opening instead. But, history is cyclical. In the 21st century, there's been this massive modern revival. Post-2000, elite players desperately needed a way to dodge the notoriously drawish Berlin defense found in the Ruy Lopez, and the Italian game ended up being the perfect, complex battleground for them to return to. Moving right along to section 2, gioco piano, also known as the quiet game. So if White puts their bishop on an active square, Black can basically just look at that and do the exact same thing. Black responds to 3bc with 3b5, developing their own bishop. This eyes White's f2 pawn, and it leads us squarely into the heart of the main variation. And this specific sequence of moves brings us to the gioco piano, which translates from Italian as the quiet game. It reflects a really interesting philosophy from the early modernist school of chess, which basically believed in solid, rapid piece development over those premature, highly risky pawn sacrifices that everyone loved back then. But hey, don't let the name fool you for a second. Even though it translates to the quiet game, this setup actually harbors some of the sharpest, most aggressive continuations in chess history. Which brings us to section 3, classical versus modern control. Now, how White chooses to proceed here is really the central focus of our explainer today. It brilliantly illustrates a massive clash of strategic philosophies. It's a total fork in the road. On one side, you have the classical variation, where White plays c3 and then immediately follows up with a d4 central pawn push. This is all about a rapid central strike, super sharp tactics, and just ripping the game open at breakneck speed. On the other side, though, we have the modern variation. White still plays c3, but follows it up with a very quiet d3 push. This completely changes the vibe, emphasizing a slow build-up, long-term positional control, and a ton of heavy piece maneuvering. Let's look a little closer at that classical approach first. The 5d4 central strike was literally the gold standard for centuries. It was played heavily by early world champions like Wilhelm Steinitz back in the 1890s. The entire goal is to immediately force a confrontation. This very often leads to a super sharp sequence where Black captures the pawn, White recaptures, and Black throws a check with the bishop on b4. White is constantly relying on gambiting, or, sacrificing pawns to create chaotic, tactical nightmares for Black. But here's the catch. While it is incredibly dangerous at the club level, it eventually totally fell out of favor at the absolute highest levels of chess. Why? Because over the course of 100 years, grandmasters systematically figured out the absolute best defenses, which basically rendered these sharp attacks kind of harmless when met perfectly. So enter the modern variation. By playing 5d3 instead of d4, White secures a rock-solid positional foundation. You're completely dodging that early central chaos. And what's truly fascinating about this slow burn approach is that it is highly resistant to computer-assisted opening preparation. Because the position stays closed and really tense, it relies almost entirely on human maneuvering rather than forced, easily solvable computer calculations. Black usually responds with a solid pawn to d6, which often prepares an a6 pawn push to give their bishop a hiding spot. Because of this rich complexity, the modern Italian is heavily featured in 21st century top-level play by world champions today. White just calmly secures control over rapid chaos. Let's pivot slightly to section 4, the two knights defense. So, what if Black just doesn't want to play the quiet game? The crucial decision point happens right here on move 3. Instead of mirroring White's bishop, Black plays knight to f6. This is the two knights defense, and it is a far more aggressive, dynamic, and counter-attacking option. In fact, the legendary David Bronstein once suggested it shouldn't even be called a defense, it should be called a counter-attack. Because Black immediately attacks White's e4 pawn, basically asking White a very direct question: what are you going to do about it? From here, White has 3 main options to dictate the pace of the game. First up, White can totally embrace the chaos with 4 and g5, teaming up the knight and the bishop to double down on attacking that weak f7 pawn we talked about earlier. This leads to wildly tactical games with virtually zero margin for error, like the infamous fried liver attack. Alternatively, White can play 4d4, initiating a classical central stripe, often sacrificing a pawn for super rapid development. Or, White can just decline the invitation to the chaos entirely and play 4d3, offering a quieter, solid positional game that feels very similar to what we saw in the Giuoco Piano.
Now, real quick before we get to the tactics, I just want to map out Black's niche third move alternatives for those of you who like to step off the main paths and spring something unexpected on your opponent. If Black plays 3.b7, that's the Hungarian defense, super solid, but it's known to be somewhat drawish. 3.nd4 is the Blackburn shilling. This one's fun. It's a cheeky false gambit designed specifically to ensnare novices who get greedy and try to grab the e5 pawn. And finally, 3.f5 is the Rousseau gambit, which is highly risky, but man, it can really catch an unprepared White player off guard.
All right, section 5, practical tactics unveiled. Let's transition from the high-level theory to some actual grounded application. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is this fantastic piece of advice, sourced and translated from Hindi, which perfectly bridges theory and real-world play. The YouTube chess educator, Professor Chess, says, castle easily. If the opponent brings the knight out, strike the center with d4. Open the rook file. If they play d6 to pin, take the pawn with check. Let's actually break down exactly what that looks like on the board.
Here are the practical steps to execute this sequence in your own games when you're playing the Italian. Step 1. Castle early. This secures your king's safety while your opponent is probably still fumbling around trying to develop. Step 2. If they bring their knight out, boom, you immediately strike the center directly with a d4 pawn push. Step 3 is absolutely crucial. You capture pawns to rip open that central file for your newly castled rook. And finally, step 4. If the opponent tries to pin your pieces, let's say with a d6 pawn push, you counter by capturing their pawn with a devastating check. This shows exactly how striking the center and opening files can just completely dismantle an opponent's natural defenses right over the board.
And what's the result of executing this specific tactical sequence successfully? You literally end up with a +1 advantage, a full extra piece. Not only do you win material because of that brutal check, but your opponent is caught stranded in the center of the board, completely trapped and totally unable to castle to safety. It is just a perfect example of why mastering the underlying ideas of the Italian game pays off so handsomely.
And that brings us to the end of our explainer. We've seen how the Italian game has evolved from these wild 16th century gambits all the way to 21st century positional masterclasses. So my final question to you is this: choose your weapon. Based on what we've covered today, do you prefer the chaotic, aggressive, romantic sacrifices of the classical variations? Or do you lean more towards the slow-burn, strategic maneuvering of the modern strategy? Whichever one you choose, I hope you are eager to set up a board right now and try it out yourself. Thanks so much for joining me on this deep dive into the Italian game.